Shavua Tov, Parashat Yitro. I'm getting over a little cold. It's what happens when you go out running and you don't dress properly. Let that be a lesson to me. In Parashat Yitro, which is named after Moses' father-in-law, we have the major event, the revelation at Sinai, somewhat incorrectly called the Ten Commandments, because in these Ten Commandments, if you actually look at it carefully, there are more than 10 commandments, a few more. But nonetheless, we will use that term. Now, before the Ten Commandments, we have the story of Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, for whom the Parsha is named. He comes, after he hears about the Exodus and the splitting of the sea, he comes to see Moses. He brings Moses' wife and children who had been staying in Midian during that dangerous period of time. And he celebrates, he rejoices, and then he has a practical suggestion, because the next day he sees Moses sit down to be the judge in all of the cases that need to be judged. And the people are lined up from morning till night, because it's just Moses, it's a one-man show. And Yitro said that's no way to run a people. You have to have associates, you have to have lower courts, you have to have a system. And Moses eventually accepts Yitro's suggestion. Now, there's a seemingly surprising question that is raised, and that is, when did this story with Yitro happen? When did he come, and when did he give the advice about how to run the courts? Well, it's written before the Torah was given, after the Amalekites had attacked, so maybe that's when it happened. Well, that's what the Ramban says. However, the Ibn Ezra says, no, it happened after the Torah was given. It's written out of place. Why is it written out of place? We have a rule that the Torah, pardon me, does not always follow chronological order. But if Torah is not following chronological order, there's got to be a good reason for it. So let's look into this idea of the Ibn Ezra a little bit more, and then we'll also look and see what Rashi holds. The Ibn Ezra says it happens after the Torah was given. What's his proof? His proof is mostly the fact that Yitro is commenting on Moses' manner of judging the people. Well, if Moses is going to judge the people, he needs to have a legal code upon which to base himself as he judges them. And well, that legal code was what was the Torah. So obviously the Torah had to have been given already before Moses sits down to be the judge. Therefore, the Ibn Ezra says that the story happened after the Torah was given, when Moses already had the rules with which to judge the people. Okay, there are a couple of other proofs, but I'm not going to need to go into that. But the question then is, well, if that's the case, why not write it after the Torah is given? That would make sense, right? If it happened after the Torah was given, write it then. Why write it before? And so here the Ibn Ezra gives us gold, and he says it's in order to contrast the way that some of the other nations of the world, or people of the world, reacted to the choosing of Israel and the miracles that God performed on their behalf. You see, Yitro heard about those miracles, the splitting of the sea, and he came to celebrate with Israel, to contribute to Israel, and according to the Ramban, to eventually convert, to become an Israelite. Others are not so sure that he converted, or just how sincerely he converted, but nonetheless, he was clearly supportive. Amalek, on the other hand, a nation dwelling in the south of the land of Israel, heard about these miracles as well, and they came as well to attack, to destroy. Why did they do that, and why did Yitro react differently? We will look into that shortly. But the Ibn Ezra is basically saying to contrast these approaches. And if we're going to have permission from the Ibn Ezra to contrast the approaches of the greater world to the election of Israel, so I will add two other characters to compare and to contrast. What does Rashi hold? Rashi seems to say that Yitro came before, as written in order, because he heard about the splitting of the sea and the miracles, and he came. However, the Torah tells us that Yitro rejoiced when he heard of all of the good, al kol tova, all of the goodness that God had done for Israel. What is all of the goodness according to Rashi? Rashi says he was thanking God, he was rejoicing about the be'er, the well, meaning that the Israelites were given fresh water. These were a couple of stories in the last parsha. About the manna, which they were now eating in the desert. And thirdly, the Torah. Whoa, the Torah. That means that the Torah must have already been given. So Rashi seems to imply that it was after the Torah was given, like the Ibn Ezra. So how can he say both? The answer, I think, is quite simple. The Torah is not a novel, a drama. You know, when you have a novel and a drama, you'll tell a number of parallel stories, and you tell each one a little bit and then leave us in tension, and go to the other one and then leave us in tension from that, and go back to the first one and have another cliffhanger there, and the second one, and so forth and so on. That's how you create what's called a page turner. However, the Torah is not intending to be a page turner. The Torah, once it starts a story, it tells the whole story. And since it's telling us a story of Yitro, he came before, and it's written before, but the story continues. He stayed there the whole time. He was there when the Torah was given, and he was there when Moses started to judge the people. He hadn't gone yet. And so therefore he made his advice, his suggestions, his contribution. And then finally he leaves a year later. Since the Torah started telling you the story of Yitro, the Torah tells you the whole story of Yitro, even though parts of it happened later on. Similarly, we have in the previous Parsha the story of the manna and how that came to be. And the Torah says there that the Israelites ate the manna for 40 years until they came to the settled land. Whoa, wait a second. In Parshat B'Shalach last week, there was no 40 years. The Israelites were not to wander in the desert for 40 years. It's in truth they were, but we didn't know it at the time because that was only the result of the sin of the spies, which happens 2 books later in the book of Numbers. So how can that be? It's simple. The Torah, once it tells us about the manna, it tells us the whole story of the manna, even though the last part of it happens far later on. Same thing here with Yitro. In either case, according to both Rashi then and the Ibn Ezra, Yitro was aware of the giving of the Torah. So the big question that jumps out from the Torah is, why doesn't he mention it? Right? We had said, according to Rashi, he was grateful for the be'er, for the well and the manna and the Torah, but he doesn't actually say that. He praises God for the exodus from Egypt, from the judging of the Egyptians and righting their wrongs and performing the miracles. He doesn't mention the giving of the Torah. And you would think that would be the main headline. I mean, after all, that was certainly up there. When God speaks to an entire people from heaven, I mean, goodness gracious, with thunder and lightning, all of the spectacle, for sure that should be high in his list of comments, high in his list of things to give thanks for. And yet he doesn't mention it. Why not? Now, in the 10 commandments, the first and the last are unique in that they require of a man or a woman to exercise control over their thoughts and their emotions. The first commandment does not require a physical deed, nor does the last one. The first one is to believe in God. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee forth from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. We are required to believe that. It is a commandment to think a certain way. And we are capable of that. The last one is thou shalt not covet. According to the Rambam, one would violate this commandment even if they haven't done anything to acquire the object of their envy. Just feeling the emotion itself is a violation. So the Torah can command us, to feel certain things. We have other commandments. We have to love God. We have to love our neighbor. We have to not hate our neighbor in our heart. So the Torah can command us about emotions. So those are 2 types where the Torah commands us about intellect and the Torah commands us about emotions. Which is primary in our service of God? Should we be serving God from intellect or from emotion? There is a clear answer to this, I believe, and that is implicit in the stories of 4 and how they reacted to the choosing of Israel and the miracles of Israel. We'll start again with Amalek, because they were the first ones to react. Amalek comes from a place of intellect, because Amalek had created an ideology, and their ideology does not have any room in it for God. They deny the existence of God. They deny the existence of a creator, of creation, of providence. Everything is random according to Amalek. Everything is chance. Well, if that's what you believe, and you've staked, yes, your reputation on that ideology, that's your identifying feature, then how do you explain the splitting of the Red Sea? How do you explain the 10 plagues? How do you explain all of the miracles that Israel experienced in Egypt that everybody saw, everybody knew? Well, it's a problem. So the only way to solve that problem is to prove that it was just a lot of good luck. And how can you prove that? By destroying Israel. Because Amalek believed that by destroying Israel, they would also be destroying God. So they came from the intellect. Their hearts were not necessarily evil. but their intellects made them put evil in their hearts in order to perform those dastardly deeds which they have been persistent in throughout history. Now, because the hearts are not intrinsically evil of the Amalekites, an Amalekite is allowed to convert and be accepted as a member of the Jewish people. And indeed, the Talmud tells us that some great Torah scholars were actually the descendants of converts who had come from a line of Amalekite kings. Contrast this with another character who we haven't mentioned, who intellectually and ideologically had no problem with accepting the existence of God, but emotionally sure did. This was a man who said, Tamot nafshi mot yisharim utehi achriti kamohu. May my soul die the death of the straight ones, and may my end be like Israel's end. In other words, he himself with his mouth recognized that Israel was chosen of God and was the beneficiary of God's miracles. His name was Bilam. And Bilam, with all of his recognition, all of his intellectual accuracy in understanding that indeed there is a God and he has chosen Israel, Bilam not only refuses to convert or join Israel, he even refuses to support them. And he goes even further, he wants to destroy them by causing them to sin. First he tries to curse them, then he wants to cause them to sin. So here you have a clear demonstration that the power of the heart, an evil heart, a heart filled with hatred, is far more powerful as a motivator than intellectual awareness. In other words, many people know that they are doing the wrong thing, but their emotions do not let them make another choice. That was Bilam. And of those who chose to be supportive of Israel because of what was in their heart, we see the beautiful, wonderful character of Ruth. Ruth, the Moabite, who was married to the sons of Naomi, one of them, there were two brothers. She and her sister were married to two brothers. They died. She was alone. And intellectually, Naomi, her mother-in-law, was saying to her, you should go back to your family. You have no future with me. I'm going back to the land of Israel. I'm going to be a nobody. It's going to be poverty. There's no logical reason for you to join us. Ruth refuses because her heart was already given to God and to Naomi, her mother-in-law. Nothing could make her change that decision. And as a result, she was blessed by Boaz with Tehei maskutech shlema. Your salary, your reward will be complete. Much more than anybody else, because Ruth led with her heart, and her heart brought her to Israel. So where is Yitro in this whole mix? I believe that Yitro is intellectually connected to Israel. He sees the Israelites, the miracles, he knows that God exists, it's true. But emotionally, he was hesitant. He couldn't quite tear himself apart from the rest of the world. The Torah says, Vayichad Yitro, Yitro celebrated. However, Rashi says there is a midrash that the word Vayichad doesn't just mean celebrated, it also means chidudim, that his skin broke out in hives. In other words, he had an allergic reaction. He felt suffering or sadness for what had befallen the Egyptians. And it could be that when the Torah was given, Yitro didn't rejoice so much, because if he's going to accept the Torah, it means he's got to separate himself from his family, from his birthplace, and he has to join with this people. And even though intellectually he knew that was the right choice, and quite possibly later on, he did get there. But at this point, emotionally, he couldn't. And therefore, he didn't praise the giving of the Torah. It's not really mentioned. But he praised the miracles which proved the existence of God, because with that, he was completely at peace. And so we see that there are different ways to serve God. And the prime way is through the heart. As the Ibn Ezra writes in a song that he wrote for Shabbat, Tzama nafshi lelukim chai, my soul thirsts for the living God. Libi uvsarei yerananu el chai. My heart and my flesh will sing to the living God. Rachmana liba bai, God wants our hearts, because that is the most important thing. And one other thought, the Or HaChaim, a great commentator, says that when Yitro came and gave Moses guidance on how to judge the people, how to set things up, why does that have to come from Yitro? Why doesn't it come from God? Why couldn't Moses figure it out? Was Yitro smarter than Moses? The Orach Chaim says, it may be that Yitro was smarter than Moses. It may be that the non-Jewish nation of Midian is smarter than the Jewish nation of Israel. God didn't choose us because we're smart. He chose us because he knew that we will lead with the heart, that he can command us, V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha, you shall love the Lord your God, and that we will do it, B'chol levavenu, with all of our hearts, B'chol nafshenu, with all of our souls, B'chol me'odenu, with all of our strength. Shavua Tov.